From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helena's, yes, good afternoon. Wake ourselves up after lunch a little bit. I'm Helena Zinkamp, Director for Collections and Services, as well as Chief of the Prints and Photographs Division here at the Library of Congress. And it's my genuine pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to a special program featuring Bob Adelman and Ira Glasser. They're going to talk about their book, Visions of Liberty. The subject matter is actually quite serious, isn't it? Human rights, civil liberties. But these are two eminent, lifelong advocates for justice who happen to be quite lively speakers as well. So this topic is going to come alive for us this afternoon. Back in 1991, when Bob and Ira, documentary photographer Bob Adelman and American Civil Liberties Union President Ira Glasser, they teamed up for a book called Visions of Liberty, honoring the 200th anniversary of the American Bill of Rights. Now, almost 25 years later, I'm looking forward to hearing if you think we've made progress or not. But we're also here to celebrate the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta and the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. That's a lot of anniversaries colliding, isn't it? Piling up. And they too will help us both appreciate the achievements and how much further down the road we have to go to actually reach social justice. To introduce you in a more formal way to our speakers, you have wonderful biographies in your program, so I am just going to mention briefly on behalf of the videotape that Bob Adelman is one of the foremost photographers of the civil rights movement. Born in New York City in 1930, he grew up on Long Island and has degrees from Rutgers, Harvard, and Columbia. He studied photography with Alexey Brodovitch, the famed art director of Harper's Bazaar magazine. With an avid interest in social and political events of the early 1960s, Bob was drawn to the sit-ins staged by young students across the American South. He volunteered to take photos of the demonstrations for the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and has continued to be involved with civil rights issues and the human condition ever since. In 2014, Bob was invited to serve at the Library of Congress as a consulting photographer to expand awareness of our visual collections. Thank you for that. Ira Glasser served with the American Civil Liberties Union for 34 years, executive director from 1978 until 2001, a great long run. Glasser has published widely on civil liberty principles as well as issues. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Village Voice, Harper's, New Republic, Nation, Christianity, and Crisis, among many others. He's also been a frequent guest and debater on such radio and television shows as William F. Buckley's Firing Line. Born and raised in New York, Glasser achieved a bachelor's in mathematics from Queens College and a master's in mathematics from Ohio State University. A few words of thanks. First to the Prints and Photographs Division staff, the Law Library staff, and the Interpretive Programs Office staff who collaborated seamlessly to bring a lot of disparate parts together for our program this afternoon. To see more of their talented work, please be sure to take a look at the very popular Law Library blog, In Custodia Legis, the valuable visual materials blog called Picture This, and of course the Civil Rights Act exhibition, which is up in the Jefferson Building all the way through January. I also want to acknowledge Roberta Schaefer. Are you here today? There you go. So quiet in the middle. Roberta, our inspirational leader, a library leader, former law librarian, associate librarian for library services, but most importantly today, the personal sponsor for this project. Mr. Adelman's consultancy in photography at the library is funded through Roberta. A self-described futurist. And here's one thing I admire a great deal. Roberta, you see connections that build a stronger future direction for all of us. I don't think I ever would have thought of the potential for combining well-reasoned law with the artistry of photography, and yet you knew how to make it happen so that there are creative agents together to make sure the world changes and grows better. Robert? Great, thank you. So we almost called this the program of the Roberts. We have our sponsor, Roberta, our wonderful Chief of Staff, Robert Newland. Bob, would you like a new middle name today, Ira?
You're outnumbered.
So more seriously then, our wonderful Chief of Staff, Robert Newland, formerly Associate Law Librarian and Mastermind for the Magna Carta exhibition. You're going to tap your three worlds of expertise, law, art history, as a great moderator for our program today. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena, for that nice introduction. It beats the last introduction I had at a program recently. Maybe some of you were there. I was introduced as Robert Newland, who has been Chief of Staff at the Library of Congress since December 1914. And I said, that's why I remember the Russian Revolution. So, Helena, thank you. That was really very nice. I think it's very appropriate today that this program is entitled Visions of Liberty, and I would also like to acknowledge Roberta Schaefer for her vision and making programs like this possible. And Roberta, we owe you a great deal and are just very grateful for all that you have and are doing for the Library of Congress. With that said, it's a little intimidating to be sitting with two extremely iconic gentlemen in the area of civil liberties and social justice. But here I am. And here's how I propose that we spend the next hour, or whatever we have left now. We're going to start off talking a little bit about how my dog-eared copy of Visions of Liberty, the Bill of Rights for all Americans, came about. And then we're going to move to Bob's photographs in several areas. And it's really Sophie's choice, trying to choose photographs that we want to talk about today. But thanks to Verna Curtis, we have done that. And so, gentlemen, I'm going to open the question to you now. How did this book come about? How did this collaboration start? And spare no details.
Well, he goes like this, but it was his idea. And those of you who may not know him know that he is pathologically stubborn about his ideas. And he proposed this book to me many times over many years. And each time he did, I told him it was impossible. I mean, I couldn't do it. I couldn't work with him on it. I already had a job as the ACLU executive director that occupied me 95 hours a week, and what spare time I had, I was trying to reserve for my children so that they could at least remember who I was. And he acknowledged that, a man of great feeling, and then said, yeah, but it's a really important book. We really should do it. There isn't a book like this. This went on and on and on and on. And I kept successfully resisting it. Then it got to be close to 1991 and the 200th anniversary, and he said, this is really a compelling time to do it. And I resisted it again. It was impossible. I couldn't do it. So he said, well, maybe we can get, it was really supposed to be a book of photographs with captions, or maybe a paragraph caption. And so he said, well, maybe we can get somebody to write the captions and to write the paragraphs. And we thought of a few people, and I asked Kurt Vonnegut if he would do it because he was a big ACLU supporter, and he said, no, you should do it. I don't know enough about this. And this went on and on and on. We couldn't find anybody to do it, and finally, I don't remember how, I agreed to do it. And then somewhere along the way, because as you can tell even by my story now, I'm not a man of few words. what happened is it turned out from being a book of photographs with captions to being a book of text with photos. And then Bob basically produced the book with Richard Seaver of Arcade Publishing. And I must say, I'm glad I gave in. And having the opportunity to sort of put down on paper what I had been talking about to countless audiences and trying to explain the importance and origins of our basic values of liberty in this country, and having it accompanied by the really glittering array of photographs that we were able to assemble, most of which were Bob, and the others that weren't his were ones that he found and selected, was a great privilege and a great joy. And I still love to leaf through all those pictures, and they illustrate things that words can't, and that has been Bob's great genius, in my view, in tracking so many movements of social justice in this country as he has. So you have a right to reply if you have a different view, but that was how I
well,
felt.
I think I think one thing that we should all be aware of is that at the time, if you remember, it was a very vivid political process, that the Constitution was celebrated, the 200th anniversary of the Constitution was celebrated. And Ira reminded me, it was not the Bill of Rights that was being celebrated, but the Constitution itself. And when we published this book, there was very little public acclaim for the Bill of Rights. Now, the reason I was always so persistent in getting after Ira is because, first of all, I didn't know anybody who knew more about the Bill of Rights and had more penetrating things to say. But I envisaged somehow photographing all these landmark decisions and all the social processes that led up to it. As it turned out, once I got into it, it was extremely difficult to photograph. For instance, I wanted to photograph the tension of an immigrant or something, and getting permission to go to Miami at that time, where they were detaining a lot of Cubans, it was virtually impossible. I couldn't get in, and so it was really very unfortunate. Yet, my experiences are that for most Americans, the Bill of Rights is what it means to be an American. And as Ira brilliantly points out in the book, it is the place that individuals interact with government, and that it's extraordinary individuals who've won for us our freedom, our growing freedoms, or contracting, depending what the moment is. And so I'm glad we got the book done, but I was very, very frustrated in trying to do the book in terms of finding photogenic and photographic opportunities. But the thing that someone just mentioned to me, that a Russian woman who is a journalist has come to America just to have her child here. She will return to Russia, but she wants her child to be an American citizen so that he will be assured of freedom if worse things happen in Russia. And that's just something to think about. Imagine bringing, and I mean, she's not the only person. Apparently, it's a very real phenomenon that to enjoy the benefits that we have as Americans is so precious that a woman would really risk her life traveling here and just to make sure her son or child or daughter was free.
Terrific. I'm going to save the Magna Carta question because I think you've given us such a great segue to begin looking at the photographs. So, Verna?
Well, you're going to comment on.
Yeah, we'll come back.
Later.
Verna, can we take a look at the first group? And this first group of photographs we're going to look at are all about Martin Luther King.
That's during the Selma March. He was having foot trouble, and in fact, he did march a couple of days because of it. And I particularly like this picture because he looks sort of militant, and when I first saw the statue here, I didn't really like it because I always thought he reached out to people, but the statue here, he's closed in, but really underneath all that, he was very determined, but in addition to that, he was a master tactician. I think of the civil rights movement as the last battles of the Civil War, and compared to the Civil War, in which I think 600 or 700,000 people were killed in the war in these last battles of the civil rights waged in major part under Dr. King's direction. There were very few casualties, and we all believed in nonviolence.
Ira, what kind of thoughts come to your mind as we're looking at Bob's photographs of now?
How much younger I was. I grew up in New York, and with that white liberal illusion that many of us had, that racism was a Southern phenomenon, and all this stuff was going on in the South, and the first big demonstration I ever went to was the March on Washington in 1963. And I was only 25 then, and I was not yet working at the ACLU. And the feeling of people, black and white, marching together in those numbers for what they were marching for at that particular time in our history was a feeling that sort of it can be remembered, but it can't be recaptured. And it's something that if I talk about to my grandchildren, who, as they come of age, and this to them is history, what that meant at the time, what these photographs document, was a participatory feeling of turbulence and change and great things underway. That it was difficult to describe, and these photographs. I don't know if the slides include the ones, but the ones particularly that Bob did of the fire hoses in Birmingham. I remember what it felt like to first see those in the early '60s there, and that I remember thinking it reminded me of an El Greco painting. It was not just an extraordinary documentation of an extraordinary social struggle, but the art of those photographs were just incredible. And I remember asking Bob for a copy of this one, which I had on my wall in my apartment in New York as my kids were growing up. And every time they would go back from the kitchen to their bedroom, they would see that, and sooner or later they would ask me, "What was that?" I mean, you couldn't even tell what it was without explanation. But to document that sort of stuff in a way that somebody's words could never reproduce comes as close as possible to capturing the feeling of what it was like to sort of be alive at that time and take part in it.
That's terrific. Verna, can we move to our next section? And this group of photographs deal with civil disobedience.
Well, I'd like to say something about Dr. King that maybe some of you know or don't. But, he died at 39, and he traveled 24 million miles as part of his mission. Most of that travel had to do with going out to try to fund civil rights activities. He was arrested, I think, more than 30 times, attacked numerous times, and he, of course, led the movement in Birmingham. That picture of the hosing is actually Lillian Smith, the great Southern writer, told me we were going to work together on something that never, unlike our book, didn't come about. But anyway, she said, Bob, she said, don't pay attention to what the whites are doing. They're doing the same stuff. She says, it's the blacks in the civil rights movement who are taking their bodies, which were chained and beaten, enslaved, and they're using their bodies. They're going to sit down. They're standing up to vote. And she said, just watch what they're doing. That's what's new. The white people are just, resisting them. And of course, she also explained to me that segregation wasn't just separating the races. It was an organized system of terror to prevent blacks essentially from voting, but from enjoying the full equality that we'd fought the Civil War to bring about.
Bob, can you tell us what was happening in this photograph?
Oh, well, this is in Brooklyn, Ira.
It was there too. Some of us didn't know it, but it was there too.
It's at a building site, and this woman is preventing a truck from exiting. There was, at that time, the building trades were they were good, very good jobs, well-paying jobs, and they didn't have enough black workers, and so they were protesting. This was a state project or something, or building a hospital, and so, and of course, why is this woman out there? Well, if the men can't get jobs, they can't be husbands, they can't be fathers. So anyway, they stopped the trucks at that point.
That was a big issue in New York that a lot of people who regarded themselves as advocates for racial justice, like me, were not aware of for a very long time. I mean, the New York City, particularly the construction building trades, was a lockdown union town. You could not have a job in the building trades if you were not a member of the union. And labor unions, because of the heritage of what happened in the 30s, labor unions were seen as an instrument of social justice. But in New York, they were an instrument of racial exclusion. My father was a construction worker, and he grew up during the Depression. And I still remember as a small boy that he hardly ever worked a full week, and it was a struggle. But the only reason he had a job was because somebody black didn't, because they were excluded from the competition. Even though there were large numbers in New York, they couldn't get into the union. And if you couldn't get into the union, you didn't work. And I remember as a small boy going to the union hiring hall with my father and never noticing that there weren't any blacks there, ever. And the reason I never noticed it is because there weren't any blacks anywhere. Not in my school, not in the stores where my mother shopped. No, when I say not in my school, I don't mean just not teachers, not students. New York was a multiracial, multi-ethnic place, but you lived in neighborhoods that were entirely singular. There were Czech neighborhoods and Polish neighborhoods and Irish Catholic neighborhoods. I lived in a neighborhood where if you came down from my building and walked, as far as I could walk as a child in any direction, you never saw anybody who wasn't white and Jewish. So one of the things that happened is that not seeing black folks in places where they were being excluded from with dire consequences, like the labor union halls or voting lines, was not unusual. So you didn't notice it. And that's why all of that stuff that we thought was going on in the South was also going on in the North in different ways, but in ways in which the people who supported racial justice movements in the South managed to insulate themselves from in the North. The man who changed that was Jackie Robinson.
There you go. There you go.
Because, this was 1947. This was what I like to call the first great civil rights event of the post-war era. And it was an event, I was 9 years old, and if you were trying to teach me about this stuff in school, I probably would have glazed over. But the Brooklyn Dodgers were the most important thing in our lives, and all of a sudden we were involved in its racial struggle. And what mattered to us, I often said if the Yankees had brought up Jackie Robinson, I would have been a racist, because we hated the Yankees.
Yes.
And what was important to us was not the color of a man's skin, it was the color of his uniform. And, but of course it was impossible for the Yankees to have brought up Jackie Robinson, because the Yankees were a different we all knew that, if you were a Dodger fan, you grew up to believe in social justice. If you were a Giant fan, you were kind of confused. But if you were a Yankee fan, you grew up to believe in oil depletion allowances. And the Yankees were one of the last teams to hire. They didn't hire their first black player till 1955, when almost every team had black players. But the important thing is that Robinson went through all this stuff that if you saw that movie 42, which was a pretty accurate rendition of that history, you're 9 years old, and this is your favorite team, and he was the most exciting player, and this is your favorite player, and they are tearing him up. And the way I first learned about racial exclusion in hotels and restaurants was because of hearing on the radio during the broadcasts of the Dodger games that when the Dodgers played the Cardinals in St. Louis, Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella and Don Newcomb had to stay at a different hotel and live and eat at a different restaurant. And that's how I came to learn about racial exclusion in public accommodations, and that's why I hated it. And nobody taught it to me in moral terms. Nobody, this was your guy. And it was an extraordinary thing for people wrote later about what it meant, what Robinson meant as a role model for black kids. But nobody wrote for many, many decades what it meant as a role model for white kids. On my block, because Robinson was our favorite player, we all imitated his batting stance, his style of running the bases. He became a hero to us. This was something that what I later called the integration of the soul. It was an integration that was going on psychologically that we weren't even aware of. And I was never aware of it until I came decades later to work at the ACLU, where I discovered a very strange thing, which I first used to joke about, and then I realized was not an accident. And that was that every male person who worked at the ACLU who was about my age was an old Dodger fan. There were no Yankee fans at the ACLU.
Diggity.
And that was, and because one of the things that happened is when you went to Ebbets Field, and Ebbets Field in 1947, 48, 49 was probably the only integrated public accommodation in the country. Because now suddenly black folks came out to see Robinson. And so I'm 9, 10, 11 years old. I'm starting to go to Ebbets Field by myself. I go to the game, and I'm sitting next to a black guy about, I don't know, he was 40, he was in an undershirt, he was drinking beer, doing what baseball fans do. And we were on the same side. And we were rooting for the same things. And when somebody did something good in the Dodgers, we're slapping each other and hugging. This was an experience that a white boy could not have had and did not have anywhere else in this country. And what it did is it created a sense of humanity. These were no longer people who were others. These were people who were us. And none of this was conscious. Nobody talked about it. But that's what happened. And this was the only place where I ever saw black folks in a normal setting. I didn't see them in stores, or in movies, or in voting lines, or in union halls, or in school. No place. I saw them at Ebbets Field. And it changed the country. That's why it was a great civil rights event before anybody recognized it as such, and not just a great baseball event. And all of that stuff that was happening in the North was happening not by law or the Ku Klux Klan. It was happening by custom and acceptance and complicity and blindness. But it happened as strongly in the North as it happened in the South. And in the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, nobody recognized that in the North. And after they were told about it, they denied it. And it became a big, and the labor union stuff and the business about that woman blocking the construction was all about that in a way that was not explicit or understood by a lot of well-meaning white folks at the time.
Wow. Verna, can you go back to the photograph of the soda fountain? Bob, what was happening here?
This was in
the White Tower, right?
Yeah, White Castle, in the Bronx, and CORE was trying to get jobs for black workers, and the pickets are outside picketing, though sometimes they came in and sat in at the facility. And but people often say, well, in the North there was only discrimination, and in the South there was segregation. But in fact, at certain points, denying somebody a job really means often denying them a way of life. This is how crazy all this is, burning crosses in the Bronx and all that. But if a black family moved into a predominantly white neighborhood and bought a house, that house could be firebombed or blown up. So the racial line was wasn't so different on some basis. And
until I saw that photograph years later, I didn't realize, and I said, the March on Washington in '63 was the first big demonstration I ever went to. This was the first demonstration I ever went to. It was a few years earlier, and my oldest friend and I went up there to take part in this picket thing, and it was New York. We weren't afraid, and we went up there, and there you can see on those faces. Those are the same faces that you see in pictures of Little Rock, and it was scary because it was the violence was just palpable. It didn't happen there, but you could just feel it outside. And as Bob says, this stuff was as present in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and Boston as it was in the South, but in very different ways.
Verna, let's move to the women's rights portion. Okay, here we go.
Is that where it starts? No. Oh. Is this the first picture? Ah. Yeah, because that's a very well-known picture. This is, what, 1970?
70 or
Yeah,
71.
yeah, 1970. And this was the first women's right demonstration, at least I know about. And scholars have told me that this is kind of one of the definitive pictures of the women protesting. And I like, they're all girls in their 20s, young women in their 20s, holding up this enormous banner. It's going across Fifth Avenue, and they're barely able to hold it up, but they're determined, and they had wonderful spirit. Now, I guess, what's the next? Yeah, you see, that's they're all in, and they're full of fervor. As we go through the pictures, we will see more complications. This is there was.
That's right. One of the ironies of social justice equality movements is that it demands the participation in things you should be opposing. One of my gay rights activist friends in New York has always railed to me about his disquiet about the push to have gay people in the army. Because he said, I don't want anybody in the army. They don't. Nothing good comes from that. And so this whole. But the point, of course, is to overcome the involuntary exclusion. So what happens is you very often get involved in pushing for things that every other part of you is active in opposing. And so you had a lot of people who were against the draft in those early 70s, saying, let's draft women. What?
I'll give up my superiority.
For equality. Verna, can you go back to the photograph of the gentleman with the hand gesture?
What does that say?
Dead than wet.
Bob, I have to ask you this. He wasn't gesturing at you, was he?
No, he was going at the demonstrators are marching down Fifth Avenue, and he's in the crowd watching. I think he's saying "Fangu." I
There
think
you go.
That's okay to say, right?
Yes, it's a well-known New York ethnic reference.
There you go. There you go. We were just bleeped on the tape, but that's okay.
Oh, yeah, we saw that.
One of the things that's really interesting about all demonstrations, and so many of Bob's pictures show this, is the violent reaction that peaceful demonstrators provoke in people who are opposed to the content of what they say. Sometimes the violence is by construction workers, sometimes the violence was by men against women, sometimes it was by whites against blacks, sometimes it was by straights against gays, but it's always the same. There's always this almost deformed look of anger and hatred and impending imminent violence that people who are opposed to the content of what is being said feel on the outside. And all those, that's why it's very hard, unless you've taken the pictures, to know where they're from, because there's something very similar about all those faces. Susan B. Anthony, by the way, was a very big supporter of prohibition, just to balance things out a little bit, and all of the depredations of liberty that involved and still involves with respect to drugs.
Oh, there's a... Well, there's, here we are 50 years later, and that still hasn't been, women are getting, what, 75 or 80% of the salaries of
Right,
men.
it was 59 back then, so
Really?
that's what we call progress in America.
Oh.
The thing that impresses me so much, Bob, about your photographs, it's just like they're so fresh, they could have been taken yesterday.
Yes. Right.
And also just the other thing, how intimate they are, how, I really feel your engagement in the photograph. You're not a bystander, you're a participant.
Well, I photographed things I cared about, and it's funny. I taught photography for many years, and whenever I had a female photography student, and we'd have discussions about what they should photograph, I'd say, why don't you try to photograph how in your life you feel you're not treated equally somehow. It's a great assignment, but nobody ever did it. I think it's very, very hard, and I couldn't do it quite that way. And some of it, got pretty ugly.
Yes.
But I always, in my own field, two of the greatest photographers I had the privilege of being friends with were Dion Arbus and Dorothea Lange, and the idea of people not being equal is very strange.
Vernick, shall we move to our last segment, which deals with gay rights? And what a timely topic.
Oh, I love this picture.
Yeah, I never saw that one. It's great.
You could see the mother. You always interpret photographs, but the mother is with her son. Father, you see, he seems a little more diffident about this. But do you read it that way, or?
I do, but God bless him, he's there.
Yeah.
That's a great photo.
Well, this dates back to the 1960s, when people, this was during an anti-war demonstration, but, people say, oh, look at all this sudden change. Well, this has been, since Stonewall, but since the 60s, there have been protests and efforts and attempts to change laws and give, equality.
Yeah, and one of the things that is not well understood still, I think, is how infectious these rights movements were, that each one became a model for the other. And this was explicit. I remember when gay people first started coming to the ACLU to ask about lawsuits, when high school students first started coming to when prisoners, mental patients, children in foster care, all these groups that were somehow outside the protections of the Bill of Rights, the civil rights movement became a model for, well, what about me? What about us? Can we do the same thing? There was the disability movement. There was this, I don't know if I saw this in a picture of yours or if I saw it somewhere else, but there was this disability rights demonstration in Syracuse, New York, in the mid-'70s, and there was a young person in a wheelchair with a big poster that said they were demonstrating against the March of Dimes, and because the March of Dimes had become very paternalistic, and they had their grievances, whatever they were, and then of course there came a time when once polio was virtually conquered, the March of Dimes became passé, and people stopped caring about contributing to disability, and they wouldn't contribute to disability rights movements. And this kid had this big sign that said, you gave us your dimes, now we want our rights. It was a great, sort of startled reaction that everybody had. And these movements all fed on each other. If you look at the history of the development of the law and the litigation and the cases and the Bill of Rights applying to blacks, and then the Bill of Rights applying to women, and then the Bill of Rights applying to prisoners, and then the Bill of Rights applying to mental patients, and the Bill of Rights applying to children in foster care. Each time those cases came in, they asked the same question. Well, why doesn't the Bill of Rights apply to me? Why can't a prisoner have the right to free speech that's involved in keeping a diary in which he's critical of the prison ward? Why can't, and so the issue of the First Amendment as it applies in prisons and all of these cases became precedents for all of these other cases. So these movements were never separated. They were to some extent copycat. They were to some extent taking the lessons of one movement and applying them to my problem. And what happened in the 60s in a single summary phrase is that the Bill of Rights became alive for people to whom it had never applied. And it happened over and over and over again. And it happened within a pretty brief period of time, from about 1954 when Brown against Board of Education was decided to 1973 when Roe v. Wade was decided. Virtually all of the rights that we wake up with every morning and take for granted were established as enforceable rights for the first time in that 20-year period. And not just by the Supreme Court, but by those movements, which really forced the issue on everybody. Yeah, that's right.
I don't know. I photographed important pictures in Willowbrook, which helped close that despicable facility for the mentally retarded. I just reminding.
Yeah, there's a picture in the book of that. Yeah.
These are dykes on bikes, which, who are a wonderful addition to the protest.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. First, I want to thank Bob and Ira for this just amazing dialogue. And I will start the applause. And now I'd like to open it to your questions. And Cliff has a handheld mic. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Oh, let's give you a mic there.
Thank you. During your experience, did you ever talk to the people and find out about what they were thinking? For example, if you had talked to me about the women's movement and anything that I had experienced, I would say during one of my interviews, the question was, how do you feel about taking a job away from a man who has to support a family? I also grew up where my father said to me, it's more important to support the boys than the women because you're just going to have babies to go to college.
Well, it has always been true, especially with respect to jobs, in an economy that has never had enough jobs for everybody. The people who have access to the jobs always benefit from the exclusion of the people who are shut out. When I used to talk about affirmative action, and to white college audiences who would ask about what they called reverse discrimination because preference was being given to blacks, I would tell them my story. And my story is that, as I said earlier, my father took jobs away from black construction workers in New York and never knew it. And I never knew it. But I'll tell you what, he benefited by it. I benefited by it. And I came to understand that because on the day before Jackie Robinson came to the Dodgers, there were 400 baseball jobs, 25 per team for 8 teams. And on the day he had a job, one white person didn't. And you could say that he took that job away from the white person, but the white person never should have had that job if there was an open competition among all the people who were excluded for reasons that had nothing to do with merit or their ability to perform the job. So, and nobody talked about women taking jobs away from men during World War II when they were all over there fighting and when our economy and the war effort was supported by women who after the war were thought to be unsuited for the very jobs that they were doing during the war. I mean, so the same thing is sort of always true, you know, and what happens with those kind of questions is that they play victims off against each other. You know, when there are not enough jobs to go around, it helps the people who have them if whole classes of people are excluded from competing for them. And it's always, I mean, the reason why poor whites in the South were always supporters of racial injustice in the South was because the blacks were the only people who were below them. And their position in the social and economic and political hierarchy was dependent upon the subjugation of black people. So they had an interest in maintaining that subjugation. And so the whole issue of taking jobs away, taking housing away, taking all that stuff, voting is a perfect example. If you're going to let blacks vote, whites aren't going to dominate the election. If you're going to let women, I mean, women in this country couldn't vote till 1920, remember. This was the land of the free and the home of, this was, you know, all men are created equal. You know, it turns out they really did mean all men. And they didn't even mean all men. They didn't mean black men. They didn't mean American Indian men. They didn't even mean white men who didn't own property. The narrowness of the application of the rights that we regard today as universal, the narrowness of the groups to which they applied and the groups who were excluded and on the outside of those protections is still something that most Americans don't understand. And we are all, I mean, my father was able to buy a home, a suburban home in 1950 because he had a job that black folks couldn't compete with. Then he was able to have that home in the suburbs because he was able to get a mortgage that black folks were excluded from getting. Then that home became the major form of wealth for working class people when they died and had bequests. And so people like me, and then subsequently my children and my grandchildren, had benefits, financial benefits along the way that were the direct result of the fact that my father in difficult economic times did not have to compete with blacks. Not for a home, not for a mortgage, not for a job. And that's how I get to go to college, and that's how my kids get to go to college, and that's how I get a small inheritance from a house that other people couldn't own. And so when white of my kids' generation and my grandchildren's generation, who don't know any of this, talk about reverse discrimination and are utterly unaware of how they were the beneficiaries of discrimination, they say, but I didn't discriminate. And you didn't discriminate. You spent your whole life fighting against that, Grandpa. So why? But the fact that we didn't discriminate, the fact that we were opposed to discrimination, did not mean we didn't benefit by it. And that's where the moral obligation comes from. And that's really a matter, as the generations pass on, You've got to find some way to teach that, because there's no way that kids who are 10 years old today can know about it.
Pete Seaver.
Bob, you've got the last word. Just tell us, that's Pete Seaver? Lovely. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this extraordinary collaboration. Thank you for being here today. A book is relevant today as it was when you published it in 1991. Thank you all.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.